I want to thank you all for having me today. I was really looking forward to coming here. This is one of my favorite events to do every year, partly because I get some great questions all week when I'm here, and also because I happen to live 15 minutes away. So it's a really nice drive-in. Get my kids off to school, come on in and see you all. Let me flip over to our session. There we go. So today's talk, when Brian approached me, and Brian, Rocky, and I talked a little bit about what we wanted to talk to you all about with the mobile world. This is something I'm very passionate about. I'm a front-end guy. I've been doing web for a long time. Before that, did things like, you might have heard of Silverlight. It's technology that used to exist. A good friend of mine, Esteban Garcia, who's here this week, often introduces me as the guy who killed Silverlight. Thank you, Esteban, if you're here still. Also did a lot of WPF. Before that, ASP.NET, even VB6, and a bunch of other things that some of you probably still remember if you're as old as I am. But in this experience of doing all these different things to the front end, the one that's probably changed the most and the fastest is mobile. It's really funny to me to talk to a lot of technologists, and we all kind of have this Sybil-like relationships with ourselves, where in one sense we're thinking, hey, I love changing technology. I like the bleeding edge. I want to hear what's new. I don't want to use old technology. And the other side, we're going, you know what? It changes way too fast, and I just can't keep up. So I just want us to keep doing what I've been doing for the last 5 years or 10 years. And I think we're all like this. It's not something that we don't struggle with every day, right? So when we're dealing with mobile, I want to introduce to you a way that I look at mobile technology and how I try to teach companies to think about it. Because it's not how you might think. So is mobile something interesting for an enterprise developer? Is it an interesting skill to have? You might not be a mobile developer today. But let's talk about the impact of what mobile has done to our industry. I mean, mobile devices aren't just phones anymore. Now we're talking about IoT as well. You might have heard about some issues a couple of weeks ago, might have been a month now, where some IoT devices got hacked and it took down some very well-known sites. There are computers in everything. Mobile is everywhere. The demand for mobile is going to outstrip the available development capacity 5 to 1 in the next few years, according to Gartner's research. That means that there's going to be a lot of jobs for this, right? Start thinking about what's out there. And I'm not talking about creating the next great fart app. I'm talking about what you create at your businesses in the enterprise. And then finally, the sales are going to reach $2.1 billion in the next 3 years. 2.1 billion units, sorry, in the next 3 years. Now, across the globe, it's not like people are buying more cell phones, but it's finding now that they're constantly upgrading, constantly changing. So how do we prepare for this mobile future? What do we do? Now, some of you here might be developers. Some of you here might be database engineers. Some might do security. Some might be network infrastructure engineers. And guess what? Mobile is important to all of you, all of us. No matter what we do, mobile is going to affect us. So what are the right questions that we should ask as we're going down this journey? Well, let's think about it. Do we build native or hybrid? That's like the first thing that comes up with everybody. Well, all we have to decide is we have to build iOS and Android, or we got to build like Ionic or Cordova or something else. That's the first question that always comes up. Technologists love to start there. Let's go do it and build it right now. And then you'll find the biggest fight you've ever had in your life, because just like the C# Java things or C# VB things that have been out there, or the Angular React wars, the mobile wars are probably the dirtiest I've ever seen. You could have a very practical, reasonable conversation with two great technologists, one who likes iOS, one who likes hybrid, and they will never agree. I'm here to tell you this isn't the question to ask, because guess what? Our users don't care. They want the apps. They want the functionality. They could give two hoots what it was built with as long as it works and does the job they want, right? Do you care what kind of technology is in your car's navigation system? I don't. I just wanted to get me to here today, so I knew how to get to this place. I didn't care who wrote the code as long as it works. So let's think about ways that we should consider mobile. So one way we can start out is think about, all right, building a mobile app, do we sit with things like native or Xamarin or JavaScript-driven native, things like React Native, web mobile hybrid, Ionic? There are over 40 different development tools and platforms that we can choose to build mobile today. Just a few. Or Do we look at developer skill sets? Can we CI/CD it? Is speed important? How do we look at these things? Well, they are important. Is speed the pinnacle, though? Maybe, maybe not. It depends upon what our use case is. What about security? Is it a little bit important to make sure that our apps are secure? Yeah, I think so. What about agility to deliver on time? That's how we get paid, right? We want to make sure that what we deliver in project management space is actually meeting the budgets and the delivery timelines that we need, and it gets the functionality. Okay, once you deploy, your hands are wiped, right? You just walk away. The app's good. Not really. We have to make sure that we can debug devices, because guess what? Things break. I had something happen to me just 2 weeks ago. We had an application that I was working with where it was been working for a year. A year. Not a single complaint. All of a sudden, it didn't work. Not at all. 1,000 users of the app for a company. Can't do their jobs. We ended up finding out what happened was the devices got upgraded from iOS 9 to iOS 10. And all of a sudden, the security model changed. And a certificate wasn't installed properly on a server for over a year, but iOS 9 was very lenient about it, and iOS 10 said, nope, sorry, not going to handle it. It's not secure. We would never have figured these things out without having some kind of monitoring and health applications into our devices to tell us this was the problem. That was the difference in having a device down for weeks versus days. What about our network? Once you introduce a bunch of mobile devices at your workplace, you now have to worry about the impact of those mobile devices on your network. Has anybody ever been at their office and all of a sudden they can't get access to Wi-Fi because there's too many people on it? Yeah? Happens to me all the time. And guess what? Mobile's hard. That's actually the good news, because we all have jobs. That's to solve this problem. It's not an easy thing to solve. So let's talk about some different ways we can look at these things. And it's not just hard for developers, it's hard for everybody in the technology industry, including our users. So how do we think about these things? All right. First thing we can look at is our service architecture prepared for mobile? Before we write a single line of code or think about the app we're going to build, think about the current infrastructure. Most of us work at companies who already have some code and some infrastructure and something there already. Very few of us get blessed with coming into a company that says, we have nothing, build us whatever you want. I mean, that's awesome. But usually there's something there, a database, a web service architecture, using SOAP, using JSON, using comma delimited files, who knows? So how does this architecture affect us? Well, we have to think about how those things work. For example, some things you should look at with these considerations. What if your architecture is returning back a lot of data? Too many rows, too many columns. Now, it might sound like not a big problem to some people because the applications at the company that you're working with might have fat clients, meaning they might be used to having all this stuff delivered across their internal network on gigabit networks, and everything's fast. So they can afford to go make multiple calls and get a lot of data back. When you go to a mobile phone, having a 500K message is not a good thing. These things have to be taken into consideration. Okay, what about many trips? I can't tell you how many times I see an application, web or mobile, this is both a problem, where the client code says, okay, go get the customer. I got the customer. Okay, now take the customer and use that ID to go get the orders. Okay, I got the orders. Now take the orders and use those IDs to go individually get the products. Okay, I got the products. You're making back and forth trips across the network. Guess what happens when you go to like 3G or slower networks? Your users hate you. That's it. So having those kind of trips can really slow you down. And then aggregating on the client. Another thing I see a lot is, let's just go get all the data from all the backend services. They're already there. It's easy. All my web services already exist. So all these guys already exist. We're making calls to existing web services, and then we bring it to the client, and then we transform the data in the browser or in the mobile application device or in an IoT device. Not a great way to do it, because those devices aren't as high-powered as servers. So we might have an architecture that looks something like this. You've got a browser up top, and you've got a bunch of services in the bottom. They could be any technology serving JSON, XML to God knows what. And then we serve static content. When we have this kind of an architecture, and we now implement a mobile device into here, the mobile device itself needs to get to that data. So another way we can think about this is by adding in something that I like to call a presentational web API layer. That presentational layer is the easiest way to get your company, who might have 100 of these service layers in existence already, without rewriting all the back ends. If you can, obviously, it'd be great to rewrite things to be more efficient. Sometimes we can't. So what we can do is we can put some kind of presentational layer on the back end, maybe in ASP.NET Core, for example, or Node, and we can take that, and then we can aggregate all those data calls on the back end. Now, that guy there, he serves to the mobile client just what it needs. One call, the trimmest, leanest amount of data that it needs. Let the server do all the work. Why not? The server is high-powered, and the user doesn't have any slowdowns. Easy way to insert something into your architecture. OK, we might have DevOps to think about too, right? I recently deployed a mobile application, and the mobile app that I deployed didn't have a DevOps team. Major application, thousands of users, really business critical. We had a Mac Mini sitting on my desk, running Jenkins, deploying it. Not a great solution. Sometimes it's good to think about these things. We didn't. So what does this mean? Why does it matter? Well, the great thing about CI, as we know, just like with Java or .NET or with web applications, mobile has to have CI involved. Continuously integrate as we write code. We need to check that that code works in the CI process. We need to make sure that we're testing the code with unit tests and integration tests and end-to-end tests using tools. Why is that important? Wouldn't you rather know that something broke on your machine as opposed to after it got deployed? And now you've got 1,000 apps in the field running around your office and enterprise, and you have to go figure out what's wrong. And you've got a lot of unhappy people. So we push our code after those things. We build our code, and then we publish our applications. And this cycle is really important. I found it to be even more important with mobile than with anything else I've done in my career. Because the mobile applications, there's very little that we can do to debug and deal with those once they're in the user's hands. Because they always act differently on different devices, because we have no control over those target devices quite often. So there's different options you can look at. There's things like Travis CI, CodeShip. Jenkins is probably the least good-looking and usable app, but it's probably the most functional that I've ever used. So I still use Jenkins quite a bit for CI. You can use things like TFS or Microsoft Mobile Center. There's lots of products out there you can use to help with mobile CI. OK, notice I was mentioning CI, but not the other side of it. Once you have your app, you have to deploy it. How do you get that out to your users? Well, at that point, we've got to figure out who are our users and how do they need to access it. What if you have one app, and all your users in this room, you're all my enterprise. I've just hired you all for free. We all get an application and a phone. I got to get you one app. Not a problem. I publish it to our internal app store, and then you just get it. OK, what happens now if this side of the room over here needs to have a second app, but this side doesn't get it? Now I have to have profiles for groups who I can deploy to. OK, now the front row of this side needs a certain app, and so does the back row on that side. We now have to have more groups and roles. You have to manage these devices. And now we throw in another monkey into the wrench. Some of you have iPhones, some of you have Androids, some of you have something else. How do we manage this process? This is really, really important. So when we deploy these things, we have to think about how do we provision them? How do we secure them to make sure if it's not bring your own device, if it's a company-supplied device, how do we make sure that if that device gets lost and stolen, that we can wipe it, that we can track it? Very critical not to have business data on that for your security and compliance teams. If it's bring your own device, it's a little bit different, but you still need security. You don't want somebody doing something in that phone that could hack in the wrong place. We also have to track and report and audit these things. We need to make sure that these devices are behaving properly, that we know where they are, that they're being used. And what if we got 1 million errors in our logs? How would you know if one device had 1 million errors versus all the devices in this room having a couple? It'd be important to know that, wouldn't it? Because if every device in this room was breaking, we'd have a major problem. But if your device right here was broken, maybe I'm not as urgent about it because we don't like you as much. Sorry. We all love you here. And then finally, deployment. That's the easy side, right? We have to get it out to everybody. And there's tools that'll do this for us. AirWatch is a very popular one. Mobile Iron's another one. And Microsoft has a variety of tools as well that they've picked up over the years. So there's tools that will solve these problems for us that you can learn about more here this week. Okay. Who here likes to deal with security? I don't see any hands. Wow. I work with a guy who's absolutely insane about security. Every security breach on the internet, he reads about it, knows about it, and comes and talks to us. In some ways, I wonder if it's him doing it. But he's just so gung-ho about this. And it's important. Really, really important. Do you want to be the person who puts your company in the news to be the next company who got their credit card stolen, for example? Or PII data? Information is king. If somebody knows where you live, your address, your phone number, the kids' names, where you frequent, that's dangerous information to get out there. Security is crucial. And with mobile applications, it's now that much closer to people who can do nefarious things. So we have to make sure we handle that. So some things you might want to think about. HTTPS is not enough. Okay? HTTPS is just one thing of many we have to do. We have to handle authentication and authorization. We all know that. I don't want you logging on to an app that you're not supposed to log into. And once you log in, and I verify that you are who you say you are, I have to then say, okay, do you have permission to do these things? Yes or no? That's pretty basic. But we also have the device protection as well. What about locking the device down so that you can't even get on the device without a code? What about being able to remotely wipe the device if it's not bring your own? Shared devices. We've recently been asked several times, because the iPhone now has this thumbprint so you can log in. We'd like to be able to make this application not have to type in a username, but associate like a touch with your thumb. Oh, great. We can do that. Oh, and by the way, this device is shared by 500 people. What? How do you associate every thumbprint with a different user on a device? Well, you can do it, but that seems like a maintenance nightmare, and at that point, it's better to just buy a new device for everybody. So these kind of things have to be taken into consideration, too. When you have shared devices, who's using it? Do you make them log out? Can you leave them logged in? What's the login period? What's the timeout? Also dealing with certificates. I just had one of these big issues recently. It seems like about once a year, one of the major cloud providers, and I think they've all been affected by this by now. You see Azure or AWS or Google has some major outage, and then some executive gets on the internet and says, oh yeah, well, we had a certificate fail. What was that? Oh, we had a certificate fail. Yeah, they had a certificate fail on a server, which then took down basically everything that that server was serving up. You want to make sure your mobile devices are updated with their certificates, which is why having some kind of a mobile device manager is really important, like AirWatch. And you want to make sure you're using secured web services. I've heard many times people who've gone back with legacy systems, or they've got back-end systems where they were only being talked to internally. Now they want to expose that data outside of their internal network through a mobile device. Well, yeah, it's technically possible, but how do you get from outside to inside? Well, we just open up the security and let them come in. I mean, I'm only giving you the device. You're a very kind and friendly person. You're not going to do anything bad, right? Yeah. So he's nodding his head. I wouldn't do it. So we do these things. We have to make sure that we secure the back ends, even if they're not secured now. If you're building a mobile application, part of your cost and budget should be to make sure that you're including in there secure all the things that we're talking to. Why? Because apps that have been running for years and have been totally secure may now have a hole in them because we're piping in through a different way. Important stuff to think about. Okay, network engineers, are you prepared for mobile today? What happens when you now have all of these devices on your network? We've gone from having everybody in our company having one device, wired, to having laptops, iPads, iPhones, Android devices, watches, other handheld devices. It's crazy. These things can proliferate and cause tremendous concerns on your network. Now think about what I mentioned earlier about having chatty applications. If you have 100 chatty applications, maybe you're not seeing an issue. Now you give all 100 of your employees 5 different kinds of devices, and now you've just multiplied that, right? Every time you add chatty type of things, you're getting more and more chat on your network. And you got to make sure that all the IoT and mobile devices are secured so nobody can hack those and cause other things to happen. These kind of things can overload your network infrastructure tremendously. So you want to make sure that your network guys or girls are all ready to make sure they can implement these things. You're going to have an increase in load and transmissions and a lot of opportunities for hackers to come in and play games with you. So very important to keep this in mind. If you don't have a solid infrastructure, IoT and mobile aren't going to work well at your company. That's just a foregone conclusion. It's just not going to work. You can't hook up and overload devices to a network and expect it to just work. So we have to make sure we plan for these things too. Some of you may have been to some of the parks here in Orlando. There's one over here across the street, Universal, one down the street with Disney. When you go to these parks, you can now use your devices inside. How do I know this? Because every time I walk there with my kids, I walk into somebody holding an iPad over their heads like this, taking a picture. So you know that these devices are working. They've got cell towers. They've got free Wi-Fi. They've got all sorts of stuff. Some of these parks hold 100,000 people or more. You think there's a little bit of chat going on around there? And it's not just their devices. The parks actually do things too. So when you're in a lot of public places, downtown New York, San Francisco, on BART, on a subway, anywhere, these places that you go need to be able to handle the infrastructure. Okay, so now let's talk about application refreshes. How many of you here have worked on an app that's lived for 20 years? Just a couple? Oh, yeah, I know you all have. So at some point, apps live for 5, 10, 20 years. And what happens is businesses will come along and say, oh, we don't have the money or the funds to rewrite this. We'll just keep adding a feature, adding a feature, adding a feature. How many of you have worked on a mobile app that's lived for 10 years? Yeah, one guy, one girl. Yes, it doesn't happen that often, right? These things, these mobile apps, these phones here in our pockets, we keep them for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. They don't stick around. And the applications have to be refreshed. The upgrades for the iOS and for Android has many different variations as well. They cause us to constantly revisit these things. It's an additional cost that we didn't have when we're building Java, .NET, or web. Because you can build an app in one of those, it'll just keep running. When you build an app for a mobile device, it may stop working at some point because the devices change and their operating systems change and prevent them from continuing. Hardware is a huge business in mobile. Who's going to manage this stuff? Your team needs to have somebody who's ready to manage upgrades and hardware refreshes. They also need to make sure they can handle the stable devices. Who has those? Who's in charge of handing them out? Physically getting them to the employees. And then making sure you've got backups. Who can do repairs? And who knows those devices and their quirks? We all have a phone, but can you honestly say you know how every variation of iOS and every target device of Android works? It's very difficult to keep up with those things. And having people who do that, we're seeing new job careers come out for people who specialize in this. They have labs. And then analytics side. A lot of companies like to have analytics for a device to figure out how are people using my app? What's happening? Give me errors, yes, and debug info, but what is the behavior of my users? I'll bet you, if you use Amazon's app to buy something, or Walmart or Target on your phone, they're tracking what you click on and where it goes. They want to know your behavior so they can put the things that you like, the things that you frequent, more closer to your fingers, and the things that you don't further away. And what happens when 1,000 users report these errors? We need to make sure that the health of our apps is something we can keep an eye on. So we can do things like use New Relic, we can use something called App Dynamics, we can use native features on phones, we can write custom code for this as well. Whatever we do, the important thing is to make sure that you actually monitor the health of your applications. Okay, the developers in the room have probably been wondering, why is he not talking about the most important thing, hybrid versus native? It's not the most important thing. Everything here is equally important. But ultimately, you have to figure out what you're going to invest your time in. Are you going to work with which one of the 40 different platforms that are out there? So I've taken some time to kind of think about this lately, and there's 5 categories I like to look at mobile development. The first of which is just pure native. You're building it for Windows Phone, you're building it for Windows 10, you're building it for iOS, for Android. You're just going to go native. This is great. You're going to get a native app, best performance, it's awesome. But if you want to build it for multiple devices, you literally have to have multiple teams. There's very little reuse. And it's very distinct. It's like building Java versus .NET. I mean, yeah, we can all write code, but the platforms are different. Then there's something I call adjacent native, only because I haven't come up with a better name for it. The most common tool that you'll hear about in this category is Xamarin. It's when you build something that gives you a native application, but it's not quite as clean as a pure native, but it's almost there. And it allows you to write in a single language and get that native application. Now, believe it or not, Java's had this for years too. There's several products out there for Java that do this as well. Oracle MAF is one of them. Xamarin's probably the most well-known, and it works with C#. Great product. Then you go down the chain, there's something called JavaScript-driven native. This is something that's come out in the last couple of years because of the growing web trends with HTML and JavaScript. People building web apps wanted a better way to build native applications that weren't just inside of a web view with Cordova. Something that kind of got rid of the stigmatisms, the stereotypes that hybrid apps have gotten. So tools like Appcelerator Titanium came out many years ago, which allowed you to build this stuff. And they were one of the big pioneers. And then more recently, you might have heard of things like React Native or NativeScript. React Native, you write JavaScript with React-like code, and it gives you a native application. NativeScript, you write Angular in JavaScript code, and you get effectively a native application. So you can now use those skills, if you got those in-house, to build those. And then, of course, we've got the Cordova-based web hybrid models, which we can use. Things like Ionic are super popular here. And then our newer categories come out in the last year. Google I/O, they really pushed this year. Progressive web apps. A progressive web app, you can think of it like HTML on steroids. You can take an HTML app now, and on your mobile devices, you can do things like pin the app to your home screen and make it go full screen Chrome in the browser and the device. So it looks like a full native app. And you can have it work offline as well. So it doesn't have to have network connection. So there's some pretty cool things coming to the browser which allow us to do things on the phone to build web apps without having to write any native code. And you can still talk to some of the native features as well. This one's much newer. There's a lot more movement to happen here, but it's growing in trends. This is a space that never stops. And I got you some information here about native. I think we all know what native's pros are, obviously. One of the cons is multiple teams, lower code reuse. If you're building for one platform, that's really not much of an issue. If you only build for iOS, you only build for a certain target of Android or Windows Phone, not so much of a problem. Xamarin, great product here. I know James is here. He had a couple sessions this week talking about quite a bit about it. If you didn't catch him out, you definitely should. C#, awesome platform, does great things. Microsoft's now made one of the biggest cons of this product a non-issue. You used to have to pay a lot of money for Xamarin per developer. Imagine if you all had to get a license. That's a lot of money, and somebody's getting rich, and it ain't us. Now Microsoft made it free. You can now write code as Xamarin for free, which is cool. So now that that's gone, basically the only big con here is if you don't know C#, which I assume the .NET mostly conference, we're all good here. But if you're not, that's a problem. JavaScript-driven native. These are the two big leaders now, NativeScript and React Native. The biggest difference between these two, besides one is based on React, one's on Angular, which if you don't know either, it doesn't matter. But if you're learning one of these two, the biggest difference is that React Native kind of takes the philosophy of, OK, there are two main targets, Android and iOS. We're going to allow you to write code with React and target one or the other or both, but you have to basically write your own conditional logic in some places. NativeScript goes a little bit different. There's some of that, but not nearly as much. They effectively take the APIs for the device, iOS or Android, and reflect on them. So you write one API with JavaScript, and you're talking to both iOS and Android. So if you like that, if you want to write one API, NativeScript's an easier way to go. If you don't worry about that and you don't mind dropping into native-specific code, then React Native is a good option. And they're both super popular, and they're both growing. Oops. And then the next option, PWAs, we talked about. Lots of cool stuff, very popular because you don't have to learn much about mobile native development. And it does quite a bit for you out of the box. If you want to learn more about it, we're going to hand out the deck. There's some links at the bottom about PWAs, some great articles. It's a fascinating growing area. I find every time I do a deck on PWAs, it's out of date in about 2 weeks. This is probably the fastest growing area on the web today. A year ago, it was a dream. And now there's people actually building applications with them. Would I build a production app with a PWA today? No. But if you ask me every month for the next year, I'm sure at some point here I'd say yes. With the other 4, absolutely. And then hybrid Cordova. This is the one that gets talked about the most. I'm going to mention Ionic here because they're my favorite tool in this area, though there are literally dozens of tools that will get you there. It often gets a lot of play because people with web skills can easily use it. But sometimes web views wrapping code can be a UX challenge. If you're trying to do super animated graphics and pixelation and easings inside of Ionic type apps, it's going to be easier to do that if you drop down to native code. It really is. But if you're building forms over data for a lot of enterprises, like most of the enterprise apps I've worked on, by far the majority of them could easily be done in Ionic and nobody would know. In fact, I've done many of them in Ionic and nobody's known. And it was easier because we had web skills and we just moved them over to go this way. If you're building a game app or something that's going out to the public and you need it to have the absolute best performance, just go pure native. But if you're building enterprise apps, Ionic is a fantastic tool to use. So overall, if you're looking for me to pick one for you, I can't. It depends upon the skills of your team, your company, your background, your goals, the target devices, what you're building. You got to pick the path that's right for you, and it's okay to choose more than one. A lot of times, I will pick Ionic or native. Or if I go to work with a team that all knows C# very well, we'll choose Xamarin. And sometimes we'll also do something like mobile web. It depends what you're building and what your skill sets are. So kind of coming back to the beginning of how do you prepare for that mobile future? You got to first learn how to evaluate these things. You got to think about them all. We can't just pick a tool. We can't just pick what we're going to build. We have to think about the ecosystem it's going into, how it's going to be used, the security side of it, the networking. How about the database side of things to make sure the data that we're serving is going to be adequate for what the mobile devices are using? All of this has to be taken into consideration when you're building mobile applications. So whether your career is in any one of these things and other tools as well, even in project management, the way you think about mobile is going to affect your career if it's not already. It's a fascinating industry, and IoT is quickly becoming part of this mobile world as well. So everyone's going to play a prominent role here, and I hope that you all make great decisions as you're working with mobile devices down the road. And I hope you have a great day the rest of the day today. Thank you.